Okay, Baltimore City's Biennial Audits Oversight Commission. We're going to get started. It's our second meeting of the year. I'm Eric Costello, Councilman from the 11th District, Chair of the committee. I'm joined to my right by Council President Nick Mosby, Director of Finance Michael Moisiev. To my left, Councilman Isaac Yitzi Schleifer, 5th District, Inspector General Isabel Cumming, and Comptroller Bill Henry. Our 7th member of the commission, Councilman Chris Burnett from the 8th District, is running a little bit late, but expects to be here with us today. First order of business is to approve minutes from the previous meeting. Is there any discussion of the draft minutes from our meeting on February 1st? Seeing as there's no discussion, is there a motion to move the minutes favorably?
So moved.
Motion by Henry. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Moisiev. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Motion carries, 6 in the affirmative, 1 absent. Next agenda item, we're going to review the 2023 work. Mr. Pash, if you could take it away.
Good afternoon, Honorable Commission members. My name is Josh Pash, and I'm here to give an update on the biennial audits. Today, I will be going over the status of the Group A and Group B biennial audits that were issued in 2023. I'll go over the follow-up audits that were issued in 2023, and then I'll present the audit plan for the Group B biennial audits that I am presenting for your approval. Next slide. For the status of the Group A and B audits that were completed in 2023, I'll be presenting Police Department, Transportation, MOHS, MOED, MOCFS, DGS, and the BDC will be presented to the board on December 20th. I'll be updating that for the next biennial audit commission meeting, as well as DHCD, Fire, Finance, DPW. For BSIT, that audit was granted a waiver to defer it until 2024, so we will be conducting that in 2024. Next slide, please. So starting with the police department, our objective was to evaluate whether the police department, crime lab, and evidence control had effective and efficient processes over receiving, processing, and sending results for items that they receive for analysis in a timely manner. We had one finding, and that was delays in the procurement of critical laboratory products and maintenance agreements for sensitive machinery negatively impacted the evidence processing. We noted there were extensive lags in procuring and completing requisitions. We also noted cases where procurement required changes in the requisition from the police months after the original submission. And we also noted one case where procurement awarded a vendor that did not meet the specifications of the police department, which were based on national standards, and they could not use it. Our recommendations is that procurement go ahead and follow the specifications provided by the police department so that when it is completed, the police department will be able to use it. In this case, they had to find alternative ways to use that machinery. We also recommended that procurement evaluate their staffing levels in order to support city procurements and to implement that. And then we also recommended that the procurement monitor aging reports to identify procurements that are stuck in the process or having lags so they can specifically identify those and work with those. We also recommended that the police commissioner establish an escalation policy and include timeframes and to consider other procurement methods so that if stuff is held up, that they will have a process to address those holdups in the police department. And then in the interim, we recommended that police and finance and procurement have meetings to discuss the prioritization and finalization of critical procurements that are in process. Next slide. For Department of Transportation, the objective was to determine whether the DOT's federal project closeout process is efficient and effective. Basically, we looked at the period from when the construction project is completed to when it's closed out with federal highway. What we noted was inefficiencies in the closeout process resulted in delayed revenues. Basically, after the project is completed, they need to close it out with Federal Highway to get that final billing. We also looked at 18 samples, and 7 of those DOT could not provide us documentation of how that process was handled. Of the remaining 11, we identified delays ranging from 16 months to 235 months from the completion of that construction project to closing out with Federal Highway and getting that final venture for Federal Highway. Our recommendations was to put together policies and procedures to basically establish timeframes for milestones so that as stuff is running through the process of that closeout, they will be able to keep it moving. And then to grant authority to one of the sections, which was contract administration, which was in the middle of the whole process, to monitor those tasks for completion, and then basically to track, monitor, and to follow up on delays. Next slide. Okay, for the Mayor's Office of Economic Development, we noted that the enforcement of the 51% local hire requirement is restricted by the law. Basically, the law requires that an intentional violation is identified in order for them to act. And so the local hiring review committee has been held back due to that one term. One of our recommendations was to meet with vendors on deficiencies and to work with vendors directly, and then also to report deficient vendors to the BOE, even if they don't meet that criteria, and let the BOE decide if they're going to take an action plan, and then also to evaluate other methods to improve compliance with the law. Our second one was we noted that MOED is tracking BOE minutes to identify city contracts. Basically, there are 2 trackings. One is the employment analysis. So when a company is awarded a contract, then they have a meeting with MOED to basically set up a plan, and that also puts them on the radar for MOED to track. And so basically what they're doing is they're going through the BOE minutes to identify those. And the next thing that is a key thing is that every month the vendor is to submit monthly reports that shows their hiring status, and that is used to calculate the compliance with the 51%. And basically our recommendations was to monitor, to track those two points. First, the contract award date, and then that employment analysis meeting, and then also to be tracking when agencies and construction companies and contractors are submitting those reports, and to follow up with them so that they can have a current, up-to-date calculation of how they're doing with the 51% compliance. Next slide, please. Our Mayor's Office of Children and Family Success, the objective was to evaluate the effectiveness of controls over the rental assistance eviction program, and we did not have any findings. Next. For Department of General Services, we evaluated the effectiveness of monitoring controls. Yes.
We'll open it up for questions as we're going through these. Councilman?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so with the Mayor's Office of Children and Family Success, when you say there's no findings, what does that mean?
So basically, we reviewed the controls, and we did not find any exceptions when looking at the controls over those different processes.
Okay, I mean, because I know my office has gotten a lot of complaints about this specific program in this agency where they weren't paying out like they were supposed to, and so people weren't evicting people because the city had guaranteed that they would be making payments, but they never did. Would that have been captured in this?
So what we looked at is, once an application that was approved, we looked at was the documentation there to support the application was approved, and then we looked at the payments for that were supported, they were controlled, and that they were accurate, that they went to the bank and they had controls around that process. So if someone was not approved, then that would not been within our scope.
No, so I'm talking about once somebody's approved, they get an approval letter, the city's saying they're covered, but then the payments to the actual property owners that haven't evicted people.
We did not identify those exceptions when our sampling.
Okay.
So I don't know if our sample didn't catch them, but basically what we were validating was the payments that went out were supported. So we weren't looking at payments that were not made, we were looking at payments that were made and that they were made accurately and that they should have been made.
So how far after the approval were these payments made? Is that part of it, or just the fact that they actually happened?
We did not look specifically at timing, but nothing stood out that was an anomaly in that area. I can go ahead and go through our report and see if there's any more details I can add to that.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't know at what point you did this report, but I'm saying at some point, the payments were eventually made, but it was a very painful, very time-consuming process, during COVID, when people got the acceptance letter and they were told, hey, don't evict them, the money's coming, and then, in a lot of cases, it was taken at least a half a year, maybe even a year before any checks were issued.
It was brought up during the audit of funding issues and kind of getting that through the process. That was not part of the scope, and we did not dive into that, but I can go back through to our team and see if any of those issues that you're referring to were captured as side notes.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Maybe possibly under the investigation of the Office of the Inspector General. So that would be an area that could be under the investigation of the Office of Inspector General. I am wondering, though, when you did the evaluation as to the applications, did you actually verify whether the information they provided was actually true or not, or did you just verify that they provided the information?
So we didn't go ahead and take the information that was submitted by the landlord or the tenant and trace that back to verify that. What we did is when the MOCF had approved it, we made sure that the documentation that they needed to approve it was there. So that what MOCFS had supported their allocation. Basically, it would have been an investigation to look at fraudulent submissions, and
Right.
that was not within our scope.
Okay, thanks.
We've also been joined by Councilman Chris Burnett from the 8th District, member of the commission. Josh, back to you.
Okay. For Department of General Services, our objective was to evaluate the effectiveness of monitoring controls over fuel inventory and distribution. We noted that DGS has not established a system of monitoring fuel usage and identifying anomalies. And what our recommendation is to work with agencies to identify those monitoring controls, basically what's important and risks to the agency, and then put those with written important and risks as DGS recognizes, and then to create a control framework around there. They do have an EJ Ward system that is a digital system over the whole process, and that has the ability to have built-in controls. And so our recommendation is that when those controls are identified, to set them up in EJ Ward, and then to develop uniform guidance and train the fleet coordinators, so basically everyone knows what they're supposed to be looking for. Next slide. Okay, we noted that key controls to identify inventory shrinkage are not effective at certain fueling sites. We noted that they have reconciliations of the fuel, monthly basis and a daily basis, but those are not occurring on a consistent basis. The cause we found was that there were a lot of fuel attendants that were not aware of this, so our recommendation in line was to train the site supervisors and the fuel attendants in charge of the daily fuel inventory and to train them on the procedures and how to do that so there'd be consistency across the board, and then to also put in procedures to have independent DGS visits to verify fuel inventory and compliance so that it wouldn't just be the same people that are at those locations, but they would have an independent set of eyes looking at that periodically.
Josh, what's
Yes.
the EJ Ward system?
So EJ Ward system is a digital system that connects to the gas pumps at the different locations. There are online systems and manual locations. For the online systems, whenever a person or a vehicle takes fuel out, it is captured in the centralized system.
Got it. Thank you.
We noted that authorization, deactivation, and emergency card inventory controls are not working effectively to restrict use to city employees for city business. What we found here is they could not support that employees who were issued cards were authorized. The authorization forms were not in there. And then we also noted that controls over emergency card inventory were not in place to check the activity and inventory. And then for deactivation, we noted that the city has a process of when an employee leaves that they capture the fuel card. However, that was actually not presented to DGS, so they were not made aware of employees leaving the city. So our recommendations corresponding to that would be to provide detailed card activity reports to the agencies. Therefore, when they're doing the review, they would be able to identify if there's charges that shouldn't be there, if there's employees that shouldn't be on the list. And then also to periodically have the agencies validate the user's assigned cards. So that's another control to identify if someone should be off the list. And then to implement a formal process where agencies notify of employee separations. So since that's not built into the process now, to go ahead and build that into the process where there's a notification to DGS. And then to establish and implement periodic review of emergency WEX cards, looking at the activity for those to make sure they have no activity when they're not assigned. Next slide. So our fourth one was we noted security cameras are not deployed at all manual sites, and our recommendation was to deploy cameras at all fueling sites. The next one we noted was there were 2 municipal golf courses that the city was paying for their fuel. These golf courses used to be under the city but were transferred out, and then we found that between 2017 and 2023 that there was approximately $50,000 of fuel bills that the city paid. And the recommendation there is to improve monitoring of the fuel invoices to make sure that we're only paying for what we're using.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir.
Just one quick thing regarding DGS, and I know that wasn't part of your findings, but as part of the discussion we had at the board, was for DGS to do a formal evaluation of the current fleet to see if there was opportunity to put the EJ Ward system in some of the cars that it did not have. I think there was maybe 20% of the vehicles did not have, and obviously that level of tracking is where we would want to be. I think the reason, just for the board's edification, is some of the older vehicles, maybe it's cost prohibitive to do it now, knowing that we will ultimately phase those vehicles out. But for the ones that are still in the pipeline and have a significant amount of runway room, the idea is to try to go back and ensure that we install them.
Right, so what the president is referring to is the CAN receiver, which is an electronic device that is attached to the vehicle. And so when the vehicle fuels up, that automatically identifies the vehicle so that the EJ Ward system knows what vehicle is through a digital means instead of a manual means. About 80% of the vehicles have that and 20% don't. We did not make a recommendation around that because there's a lot of different factors, whereas not all the vehicles are owned, some are leased, some are rented, but that is a course of action that the city can look into.
Actually come across the camera situation as well. I was just wondering, was there any response to that? Because there's a lot of areas in the city where our cameras are just not working.
So the response from DGS was that the fuel sites are owned by different agencies, and that would be something that the other agency, so there's a fuel site, a fuel pump on a Rec and Park site, then they would be responsible for that. So our recommendation was still to create a policy centralized from DGS to spread that out, and but that was a response.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and this isn't for Josh, but this is more to share with my colleagues from the council. When this audit was presented to the Board of Estimates, we had, as the council president remembers, there was a very brief conversation where the city administrator was encouraged to talk to DGS about maybe centralizing fuel distribution under DGS, because it certainly appeared from the audit that some of the problems resulted very directly from the fact that DGS was taking a kind of laissez-faire approach because so many of the depots were actually under the administrative control of other agencies, and that this is something that really looks like it would benefit from some centralization of management. And so I just wanted to bring that to the council's attention very explicitly, because I think this is something where support from the city council could help the administration look at this matter in a slightly different fashion. Thank you.
Next slide, please. So the follow-ups we performed in 2023 are listed. I will go into detail of the partially implemented and the not implemented. To go over the implemented, police had 7 implemented, DOT had 4, MOHS had 0 implemented, MOED had 2, and MOCFS did not have any prior findings to follow up on. Next slide. For the police department, partially implemented, we noted that for the performance measure, percentage of priority 1 calls for service dispatched to officers in less than 60 seconds, the criteria and the target need to be reevaluated. One of the things we noted that the target was 90% in 2017 and was dropped to 15% in 2018. And so the finding and the recommendation was to develop a policy procedure around those performance measures to basically explain why they're set at what level. And then what we also found there was the calculation of the 21 and 20 reported results was not supported. When we recalculated, the numbers were not accurate. The other performance measure we looked at was percentage of time patrolling officers spend on proactive policing. In the prior audit, they did not have documentation to support the amounts that were in the budget book, and that did not change when we did our review of 21 and 20, that the documentation still was not there.
So, Josh, they put the wrong numbers in the budget book?
So the supporting document, so basically the way we know they're correct is we look at the supporting documentation. So that was not there to support those numbers. Basically, the audit rule of thumb is you can't support it, it's not right.
Sure.
So that's what our conclusion was.
So when, I assume you asked them during an interview how they came up with the number, what did they say?
So they basically just said that their supporting documentation process is not sufficient, it's flawed, it's weak, but that's what they had calculated.
So do they have plans to strengthen that process?
That was their response in the original audit.
Okay.
Next slide. MOHS, the objective was to determine the implementation status of management action plans for those prior recommendations. What we found was, so basically the scope was to determine whether MOHS has effective and efficient policies, procedures, and processes in delivering their permanent housing program. And the permanent housing program is to get indefinite leasing or rental assistance paired with support services to assist homeless persons, including with disabilities. What we found in the prior audit was it would take 158 median days, or an average of 240 days, to transition individuals into permanent housing. We noted that the absence of available housing was one of the causes. Another cause was to obtain necessary personal documentation to meet the federal rules was a delay, and that there was a lack of monitoring controls to capture and to work on those delays in the process. We also noted a lack of review of financial and housing utilization data, basically identifying which housing was getting the best results, and they did not have that. And there was no reports on the time required to complete the key activities. So from the different phases, they were not able to tell how long it took to get those phases, which would be used to identify areas to work on. And then there was no processes and controls to validate that client submitted information for the permanent housing services. So the recommendations was to work with Journey Home, DHCD, other stakeholders to develop an inventory so that they can meet the need. We did note that MOHS did create 2 positions to do this, and that they did work with landlords and property owners, and they actually identified approximately 2,500 affordable housing properties. However, those were not allocated to MOHS to use in their program. They were allocated to DHCD. Next slide. Our recommendation is to analyze affordable housing projects to include in the inventory, and we did note that they had started the process with Home America Rescue Plan and with DHCD to increase the supply of affordable housing. Since it wasn't completed and it was just in process, we marked that as partially implemented. And then to analyze subrecipient permanent housing performance throughout the year, to look at underperforming projects, to put resources to where they would have the most benefit. We did note that they have a ranking and scoring process. However, it is not completely fully implemented, and there are discussions underway to determine the future of the single room occupancy units, which are known to be less effective and not desired by the clientele. And because that process is still in place, we marked it as partially implemented. Next slide. Recommendation 3, work with Maryland Department of Health and Social Security to improve the process of client information. Working with homeless, one of the causes was it's difficult to get that information that's required by the federal program. We did note that MOHS has formed a partnership with Identity Access Project, which assists in getting birth certificates and photo IDs. However, they do not have any partnerships in order to get Social Security documentation, which is one of the goals that they're working on. So that is still a gap in getting that personal information. Next slide. Okay. Recommendation, develop ad hoc reporting, which I had mentioned earlier, to track how the activities from application through housing and to identify milestones, specific dates, and then to go ahead and do an analysis of that to determine where the gaps are. This is not implemented because they do not have a report to analyze those key milestones. And then the next one is to do that analysis, and they don't have the report to do the analysis. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to go over the Group B proposed audit plan for 2024, and I guess I can pause to see if there's any questions on the 2023 audits. So in order to come up with these, we conducted discussions with the agencies to identify risks that would be that are on their mind. We looked at the prior audits to identify risks, and then we have the proposed audit objectives in the next slide. So Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, it was presented to us from a couple different parties to include them in the 2024 audit plan and potentially substitute them for Department of Law and Department of Planning. We can discuss that once I go through the rest of them. For Baltimore City Health Department, our proposed objective is to look at effectiveness of controls over the contracting process, such as professional services and grant subrecipients. What was identified is the procurement process for this contracting takes a longer time, and this would be an analysis of where are the control points and the timeframes there. For Baltimore Police Department, it is the effectiveness of the staffing schedule, basically assigning staffing all the police across the city, tracking leave, time off, and the scheduling of all of them, which they identified as an area which they could benefit from an audit. Department of Human Resources, effectiveness of the hiring process. Department of Law, effective controls over collections, that is general damage to city property. Basically, if, let's say there's a car accident and a traffic light is knocked down and it belongs to the city, this would be the process to collect damages from that from either the party or their insurance, and the effectiveness of that process. For Department of Planning, effectiveness controls over the CHAP tax credits. For Department of Rec and Parks, effectiveness controls over resource management and payroll. They identified that they had many, many locations and controls over the staffing those locations and also managing timekeeping and payroll of all those remote locations. Department of Transportation, effectiveness of minor privileges processes. Basically, the minor privileges is if there's something that a business does that affects the public right-of-way, so if a restaurant has tables they're going to put into the public domain, or someone wants to put in a handicap ramp, which is going to go into the public domain, Department of Transportation is over that process of approval and review. For MOED, the objective is the effectiveness control structure over non-recurring grants. What was noted in our discussions was they have the large regular grants that are established, and then they have smaller grants, which are either first-time grants or smaller grants, and to look at the controls over those processes and those grants, and ideally what they would like to get out of it is pretty much a template that they can apply to new grants that come in and have an effective control structure over those. And I will take any questions.
Two things, you go, yep, right there. On Department of Transportation, effectiveness of minor privilege process, if you could please be sure to look at the outdoor dining street closure program and the outdoor dining relief program. So those were two programs that were propped up during the summer of 2020 in response to the pandemic. And DOT has made some tweaks to their policy on outdoor seating. There's been a lot of back and forth with applicants about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, et cetera. And then I was also curious if there'd be a way to look at the special events process. The administration has, again, for the I don't know how many years in a row, changed the special events permitting process. So I don't know if there's something to look at there, but it seems that a lot of the responsibility that Rec and Parks had for events that are solely within a park and do not protrude out to the public right-of-way are now being managed by DOT. So you may consider reaching out to the administration to get a copy of that policy to see if you can understand it. I'm struggling to understand it. I don't know how my colleagues up here feel. Colleagues, Mr. President,
It's not germane to the point you just brought up.
please.
Okay. A couple things. One, for Department of Transportation, I'm not sure where the appetite of this body is, but complete streets have come up significantly, not throwing complete streets out, but over the implementation and effectiveness of the prioritization and engagement with community. I'm not sure if that's a possibility. I don't see Department of Housing Community Development here. Are they typically not part of the yearly agency? They were in the other round because it's biennial. Yeah. And then, okay, the last thing is Department of the Police Department. The procedures implementation associated with towing for non-emergency situations. That has been a huge problem in the past, and it seems like it potentially still is a problem, so wanted to kind of bring that up. So
Okay.
I don't know, in the past, when we've spoken about this, Mr. Chair, and we've kind of did dog legs off of, I guess, what the plan was, how do we determine to ensure that the appropriate resources are given from the auditor, or that we kind of prioritize these things in the right fashion? How have we done that in the past?
Well, we've prioritized the 8 biennials for each year.
Yeah, I understand the agency. I'm saying the specific audit that the angle in which we're taking with the agency.
So the commission has provided input to the auditor, and the
Yeah.
auditor's made a decision based on kind of the input of this group. But beyond that, I guess I'd defer to Josh for the rest.
Yeah, I guess the question is, at this point, after we've given them kind of the direction, he's presented it back to us, is there any precedence for us to change direction with new information that we might have? I guess that's the question.
I think once or twice we have.
So, Mr. President, typically in these cases, and actually with the police department, we had ranked the 2 highest. One was towing, and this one. So in these cases, what we have done in the past is we've gone back, we've looked at basically the proposal and kind of the resources and what information's out there, like what's auditable, and then came back and basically sent an email out to all the commission members, and then had them come to, let's say, a vote or a meeting of the minds, and then we would go with that scope. So basically, it's number one, us identifying, I guess, the kind of the audit position, and then number two, what the commission basically chooses. like, for instance, if, if it was something that would be like very, very minor that the commission was recommending, not in this case, that would be something that we wouldn't put out for,
Understood.
for the assessment. But, so my action plan would be, is to kind of, number one, dive into these different recommendations, and then compile them, send them out to the commission, and then get that feedback back, and then see what the change of course is.
Got you, thank you. Look forward to seeing that communication. I guess, Mr. Chair, also, when we have split up the groups, has there ever been a time that we've kind of gone back to a group that was in the previous group to focus on something that might have been really important at that particular time? I assume that we've never done that before, right?
No, basically, they
We've
are
always
set-
kept with the schedule, right?
Yes, that's actually built into the charter. However, we do have requests, and then we basically analyze requests based on staffing. So if there's an area that you have a specific request in, we would love to hear it, and then we would do an evaluation of our resources and get back to you.
Got you. So that evaluation of resources, that's the next question I was going to go to. That's going to take place when you come back to us about, for us to figure out ultimately what we decide to do. You're going to lay out an option plan for us. We're going to decide that, and then we go forward. But during that evaluation period, you're evaluating the resources to determine what you can and cannot do.
Yes.
The only other thing I know that has come up and will continue to come up is the administration has had a really difficult time of coming up with a plan to do a full-scale evaluation of kind of our tax incentives from a real estate perspective and the tracking of TIFs and pilots and kind of how that looks. I know that that's a big task. That's not a small task, and it's not part of this group. But I would just want to throw that out there, even if we can't get it done this time around, that there's a full-scale performance audit on that moving forward.
So we would reach back out to you to kind of look, because that would cross multiple agencies, and to see if there's a specific one that you would want to focus on or have the key component. What we prefer to do is not have multiple agencies in an audit, because it takes a long time to get responses from
Understood.
multiple agencies, and then also identifying who is the responsible party.
I believe that would only be with DHCD and maybe finance. I'm not sure. I think ultimately finance, from Treasury perspective, is responsible for kind of monitoring the program.
Okay, so you wouldn't see a treasury component in there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'm following where the council president is going, and I think we can break this up into a couple different things, and then figure out where and how the Department of Audits can best support the existing efforts in some of those issues. Like, I know the Board of Finance is recently received a report on TIFs, and that has some additional information that has not previously been regularly consolidated into one place. I also believe the Finance Department did at least a preliminary assessment of different tax credits. And I think the council is doing its own version of that.
Well, that's all accurate. I believe many of the things that we're seeing has been generated by the council because we've been pushing on trying to break down the numbers. Right now, just in full transparency, we've gotten 2 different answers back, which has been strange, and we've asked for.
And so that's, I get, so I think I see where you're going with talking to audits, because I think if it was a matter of taking 2 different existing chunks of information and analysis that had already been done separately and trying to help us sort out where is objective truth in there? That might be something that audits can do, and we would have to figure out from a resource perspective when we fit in doing that work. But we'd be happy to have that conversation with your office offline.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Auditor. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Schleifer?
Thank you. I'm not sure if this is the right department or not, but I see in number 8, the effectiveness of control structure over non-recurring grants. Did you guys look at the free money program?
Not as of yet. I mean, as part of this program,
Yeah.
so we
Like the
haven't-
one where they're giving out money every month, no strings attached?
we did not specifically
What's it called?
select the different programs,
Yeah, oh, guaranteed income?
but if that is under the MOED, then adding that, make sure we get coverage on that program shouldn't be a problem.
Do you know which agency it was under?
Yeah, Children and
Mayor's of
Family.
Children and Family Success.
Oh, okay, so it would be under that one.
Children and Family.
Children and Family Success.
That's scheduled for the next year.
Okay.
President, and then you.
I'm very
Mr.
patient. I can wait till next year.
All right, Mr. President, then the.
Thank you,
IG.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Auditor, have you done anything related to ARPA to date from a performance or financial perspective?
We have not dived into the ARPA program, no.
Is there any appetite to do so?
Yes.
What would you need from this committee to help you out to do that?
So the Mayor's Office of Recovery is not part of this program.
Understood.
So that would be an audit request that would be outside of this. And that
So again, what would you need from this committee to help you out?
So basically, we would need a scope of what you're specifically looking for. There are certain audit shops that they'll go into an agency and they'll just audit everything, and then the audit takes years. So we want to be focused and pinpoint. So the MORP has basically many programs, many agencies, so it would be something that we would want to focus in and target. If you just want to look at, let's say, MORP's allocation of funds, that would be at a high level, but if there was a specific program or funding, then we would be able to target that and put that within a time frame and a scope and, manage resources around that.
Mr. Chair, outside of the statutory requirement for us convening as a group, has there ever been a time that we've convened a group to talk about an audit that fit outside the scope of the biennial charter requirement?
We have, and we're going to be discussing shortly the request for an audit of Muncie with respect to Safe Streets. But I think we talked about in 2017 or 18 a audit of BPD overtime that was not in the year that we were doing them. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think you have the timing on that right, but I also wanted to take the opportunity to share that I believe the up and running Charter Review Commission is going to be receiving a request to expand the size of the biennial audits program to include sufficient slots to rotate in agencies and entities that aren't on the regular list of definitely every 2 years. The smaller agencies and offices that can be targeted for one-off examination. And the program itself would just do more total audits in the year. That's a charter review request, and it's also, actually, I'm sorry, I should be looking past you at Michael. It's also in the Department of Audit's budget request for the next year, the idea that we would have the additional resources needed to have the flexibility to do more audits that aren't named explicitly as Group A or Group B agencies in the charter.
Yes, Mr. Chair, so the council appreciates the work of the Charter Review Commission and knows specifically that request. I guess the question is specifically to what we're doing now and what we will charge the auditor to do in 2024. If we could elevate the idea of doing a performance audit associated with the ARPA funds and the program and its management, definitely interested in hearing, I guess, this body's want and need to do so. So if you could add that to the list, Mr. Chair.
Sure thing. IG? You got to turn your mic on the,
Okay. I noticed when we were going through the Group A and Group B audits, of course, Group A was fiscal year 21 through 22. We still have not completed 5 of them.
Correct.
So I'm wondering, and I have two different points, but I'm wondering, because then we're now listing for Group B calendar 24, we're listing another 8. I'm wondering if we're being too ambitious because we didn't even finish last time. So, I mean, it's more important to get things done than to just keep listing things. Also, I concur with the council president that ARPA would be an excellent thing, and I also believe that Monzi and Safe Streets are also needed to be done as a on-off audit.
we're going to get to Safe Streets here momentarily. And then I think what I'm going to recommend, Mr. President, we'll work with your office to scope out what the ARPA audit would look like and come back with a recommendation on that one. IG or other colleagues, any other, Councilman Burnett, before we get to, we'll leave the Safe Streets thing till the end.
Yeah, it's on the slide. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So for the Health Department, the grant subrecipients, where was the scope of things that you were looking or planning to look at? I'd gotten feedback from one of the subrecipients that there was just a lot of issues with getting checks out and getting folks paid, which obviously isn't unique to the Health Department. But is that something that'll be in the scope of this particular conversation or audit objectives?
If it was related to them not having a contract, then yes.
Okay.
And if they're, like, at this point, we haven't selected certain subrecipients to include in the audit scope. It'll be like looking at the population and then selecting them based on a random sample or a auto judgment stratified, big ones and little ones. There's a specific program that you have in mind. We have no problem making sure that we add that in the mix. And then if you have a specific example, I can give you a better answer if that would include it in the audit. I can't tell you right now because I'm not sure the details around it.
Yeah, I think the concern was raised that they were more of a larger institution. They could sort of carry the weight of waiting to be paid, but there was some equity concerns raised that smaller entities that are subgrantees can't necessarily survive for long periods without getting paid their grant funds. So that was more the conversation.
Right. So that was actually a factor in selecting this audit. So what I'm aware of is a lot of the late payments happen because there's not actually an agreement that's signed and sealed to pay them, and that was the scoping part we were looking at it. My hesitation to respond to you, because if you're a situation that you're referring to is there's a contract in place and they send an invoice and just no one pays it, but basically the whole procurement process, that's not what our scope is looking at, which is why if I can get more information on you, I could give you a better answer. But it's been noted in many places that basically not having the procurement process completed results in the issue you're identifying.
Okay. Yeah, I was just thinking if there was any metrics for how quickly entities should, or goals that are set, or best practices, that kind of thing.
So that gets within the whole accounts payable and invoicing process, which we're not looking at. But like I said, I could give you a much better answer if you could reach out to me, email, and then give me that example. And then, I would say there's a good chance that it would be included in here. And then if we have certain names to add those into our testing sample would not be a problem. We'd still do our sampling, but to add in other ones we'd be happy to do.
Okay, all right, I'll shoot you an email. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any other questions on this?
Can I give a couple responses?
Please.
Okay. Mr. President, so just to clarify, the biennial audits are not the only projects we have. We have the annual finish report, single audit. We do a financial audit of the library. We are actually in the process of recruiting for additional positions right now, which would give us additional resources. And the way that additional audits and projects has been handled is just basically an agency or council would reach out to us directly, and then we would make that evaluation there. This committee, we have been specifically identifying and working with the biennial audits that are in the charter. I'll stop there because I remember the other thing I was going to say. Okay, that's all I have.
Colleagues, any other questions on this? On the audit plan? Okay. I believe that the commission would like to request that you all take a look at MONSE, specifically the administration of the Safe Streets program. I'm going to turn it over to Councilman Schleifer to talk about that briefly and then open up the floor for discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so the request for this audit, there's been a lot of questions raised in the past, and there's really a lot of inconsistencies that vary based on different locations. There's also been a major changeover of who's overseeing locations. It used to be that there was individual oversight, and so some locations were very high performing and some were being run by other entities that were a lot lower performing. Now it's kind of broken down into two different entities. There's Catholic Charities and there's LifeBridge. And so there is still a huge variety of performance and what's happening at each one. And the council, myself and many of my colleagues have asked just different questions, whether it be performance-based or financial-based, and we haven't gotten a lot of answers, and we've been referred to other entities. That was even while it was still under MONSE fully. Now it's sort of under MONSE, sort of under those entities. We saw that also during previous hearings where questions were asked of those entities, they would defer to MONSE. So I guess we're leaving it up to you to try to sort through that to be able to show us the performances that we'd be looking at, and I guess location by location based, because there would be a pretty big variety based on which one you're looking at. And so I just think that we should be looking at all of them and figuring that out, and also understanding the flow a little better, the controls, the flow from MONSE down to the locations, and then other just details and other things just to see if there's consistency across the board based on policy or procedure. There were some questions that were raised at previous hearings, like what is the policy if they mediate a conflict that involves illegal guns? What happens next? Well, depending on who you speak to and what location you speak to, you'll get different answers. And so that's the type of thing that we're looking to see.
So question, is there certain metrics that you have questions about, or is this something where there's like no metrics and it's just kind of going in there?
We're not clear on what metrics would exist. I mean, we don't have enough information to even know that there's consistent policies across the board or different controls in place. So if one location's spending money on going to a conference or purchasing sneakers or buying supplies or buying vehicles, how does that work? Who does that go through? Who approves those expenditures? Is it consistent across the board? When you're looking at an agency, you kind of already know the hierarchy. Here, the agency is MONSE, but this is a program under there where there's been intentionally different levels placed in between the agency and the locations. So using some of that same framework, but we'd have to go a little bit outside the box on this one because there's so many different angles to it.
Okay, so just as a follow-up question, so looking at controls over spending, who's authorizing what's an allowable expend, so that is, you know, one area that is clearly defined. And looking at, you know, how many crime or negative events were prevented by the SAFES program, that would be a much more difficult audit to perform because being able to capture that unless they had like really good documentation of, you know, different events. Sure. But if there's other performance metrics that there is, whether it's collecting of guns or, you know, that there is basically something that it would be more easy to document and to put that around. So what I would like to do is kind of put together a scope and objective and then run it by the commission and then get feedback on that, because basically I need something to start with to kind of make that evaluation and kind of like pick and choose and tell you like this one is going to be really hard to evaluate, or we just don't have the skill set to go in and say, did you change the mind of, you know, this person? Whereas if there's like financial controls and allowable, or actually, you know, looking at policies and procedures across different sites for consistency, you know, that's something that, you know, we can scope in and get a clear objective.
Yeah, no, that sounds good, and I look forward to seeing that, and then we can zero in a little bit better. Because right now where we stand, we're not even at the most basic level of understanding. So even just understanding the chains and the control and the process and the hierarchy, that's not clear right now. And you ask two people, you get three different answers. So that would probably be a good start, and then we can zero on specific objectives. But I understand certainly, you know, measuring a specific type of crime in that geographical area would be very time-consuming, very difficult, which is something that we should have and something that Monty should be providing. But from your standpoint, I think that just even understanding the basic stuff that we understand from city agencies would be a great start, because this is city money being used.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm happy to let the IG go first.
My suggestion on this particular case is to follow the money, just to see where the money flows out and where it goes to. Because as far as determining, you know, the intent of the crimes and that, it's going to be incredibly difficult. So that just following the money would give us a lot. So.
I have to admit a little bit of disappointment that I really hoped that when the IG said follow the money, I really expected all of the faces to light up for the staff members of the Department of Audits. Like maybe it's just something you hear so much that eventually it just doesn't thrill you anymore. But what I wanted to say is I think that the city auditor's got a great idea in terms of putting together a scope and letting the commission review it. I did wonder whether there might not be some value also to maybe the council and one or two members of MONSE sitting down ahead of time, because as Councilman Schleifer pointed out, like it wasn't even clear what metrics they were collecting, such that you should be looking at what we're checking. Like maybe it might be worthwhile doing a pre-audit conversation to even get a sense of what information is available that the council would like to learn more about, and that way you have a better chance of having that initial draft audit scope come back in a way that's productive for working with the council.
Yeah, and I would be fine and happy to participate in a meeting like that. I can just tell you there's been questions asked, committee requests, and other questions asked at hearing where we were told follow-up would be provided, and it has never been provided. And so, you know, happy again once once the audit team puts together kind of like a scope of what they're looking at, to then have a meeting, a pre-meeting to figure out, to expand that. But, I've attempted to do that before.
I'm just trying to avoid, like, I think you gave a great illustration earlier in the meeting today when you asked a question about the rental program audit, where it just wasn't in the scope of the audit to look at how long does it take to pay people. And that has, turned out to be something that is of great interest to people. So we want to do everything we can to make sure that all the right questions are in audit scope for when we do this. So thank you.
Thank you.
I did remember my response. It was to Ms. Cummings. You had mentioned the 4 audits that are set for January. All those are in the tail end, and basically we're just wrapping it up, which is, yes. And then keep in mind, when we give those January dates, we actually have to submit it to the BOE 2 weeks ahead of time. So the completion date is actually expected to be before these.
So, Mr. Comptroller, is the ask for the auditor to put together a draft scope for us and then return that back to the commission for review?
I will take a page out of the finance director's book and say, that sounds like a very reasonable request. I think we can do that. And also, just to clarify what we're specifically asking of the Biennial Audits Oversight Commission, this is not one of the regularly scheduled audits for the coming year. I think that the technical term is, we really, really, really hope that we can squeeze this in. We have some expectation of having HR and finance help us fill some vacant positions that would bring our staffing levels up, and that would allow us to do this along with the 8 audits that are required by the charter. What we wanted to sort of ask of the commission in advance is some flexibility to be late with the audit of either law or planning if we are not successful in getting our resource issue addressed, and we have to make the call that something else isn't going to get done because we've decided to add the MONSI audit in at the beginning.
So, Mr. Comptroller, it's a fair request. My vote would be that we would delay law if we had to delay anybody between law and planning. Thank you.
Mr. Chair. I would urge the committee that we not jump the gun on this, that we actually allow the auditor to do his work and put a scope in front of us specific to MONSI and detailed around safe streets. I think we've already determined that from a subjective perspective, there might be some difficulty. I think there was a great recommendation earlier that maybe having a pre-audit meeting with MONSI to try to determine the angle in which we would go down an audit path. But with limited resources and from an audit perspective, the sensitivity of timing as well as kind of the nature and the scale of reputation of our city, I think ARPA is an important one that we also put in that same evaluation to determine where we go from a priority perspective. So I would just again urge the commission. I know that there's a lot of want and need, and there has been for some time to do an audit associated with MONSI and Safe Streets. But I think when we talk about the $641 million from the American Rescue Plan money, and I think some of the concerns that have come across as it relates to spending down that money, and as we continue to go further, the potential for it to be crawled back, the reputation of our city is really important to me. So with that, again, I urge this commission not to jump the gun, that we not come up with a decision on whether we go down this pathway with Monty, but we allow the auditor to take time to maybe sit down with us further and figure out what those scopes look like, and then we look at the entire complete package to determine what we think the next round of audit should be and look like.
Thank you. Any other discussion? So, Mr. President and colleagues, what I'd like to offer up would be a motion. I'm not going to make the motion, but just want to explain it, that we request that the city auditor reach out to Monty and to the ARPA office to have conversations with both entities and then come up with a proposed scope of an audit along with the resources that would be necessary to conduct that audit, and then bring those two plans back to this commission in January. Does that meet the intent of kind of what the group discussed?
Yeah, I think that's the strategy I'd like to take, and that way we can objectively look at what's ahead of us, and we can figure out from a prioritization perspective and the resource constraints that the auditor currently has, the best plan forward.
Okay. How much time do you need to do that? Mike.
Depending on the time to get to those parties, we should be able to get that within 3 to 4 weeks, I would imagine, max, to meet with them, do an analysis, and then reach back out to you.
Okay. Why don't we schedule to reconvene on Tuesday, January 23rd at 10 a.m. It's during the Ways and Means time slot, so I'm certain that that will be open. Does anyone have concerns with that time?
Can you give me a second?
Yep. Tuesday,
Tuesday, the 23rd.
January 23rd,
10 a.m.?
10 a.m.
Okay, yeah, I'm good.
And then, Josh, if you could provide us something in writing, say by the Friday before, so that we have the opportunity to review that over the weekend.
Can I request approval on some of these audits to get our planning done?
Yeah,
ASAP?
let me, so let me go back on, let's finish up this item. So, I move that the commission request the city auditor engage directly with Mayor's Office Neighborhood Safety Engagement, as well as the ARPA office, I don't even know what that agency is called anymore.
Recovery services.
Recovery services with that agency to discuss, Office of Recovery Programs, that's right, to discuss their operations and develop a draft scope of audit for each of those, along with the level of resources that would be necessary to conduct those audits in calendar year 2024, and present that information to this commission in writing by no later than Friday, January 19th, and for us to reconvene on Tuesday, January 23rd at 10 a.m. Is there a second to that motion? Second by Schleifer. All those favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Motion carries 7-0. On to the proposed audit plan for calendar year 2024. Is there a motion to approve the audit plan with the input provided from the commission?
So moved.
I get a quick question, a little unreadiness.
Yep.
So if we approve this plan, just the 8, that's what we're asking for right now, right? I thought that we were looking to make one of the other ones alternative to that. I guess it's going to be this body's position that if we were to come back with scopes that we thought should be done immediately, that there would be, I guess, a second vote by the commission to substitute one of the 8 that's currently in the round robin for one of the scopes that we brought up Is that the one of the committee with this motion?
Yeah, and I think we would make that determination on January 23rd.
I just wanted to make sure we put that on the record so we're all on the same page.
Yes, sir, Mr. President. So that motion along with the comments from the president, so let's say tentative approval of this audit plan pending further discussion on January 23rd with a final vote then. Is there a second to that? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say nay. That motion carries. Any other business before the commission? Colleagues? Anyone from the public? Mr. City Auditor, thank you very much. We're now in recess.